Okay, so it is really a tremendous pleasure and an honor to introduce our keynote speaker for the day, who has been tirelessly working really on this sort of topic and this issue for many years. Dr. Sariya Cheruvalil-Contractor is a feminist sociologist of religion. She is assistant professor and research group leader for faith and peaceful relations at the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University here in the UK. Her work lays particular emphasis on democratic research methodologies that work with and for research participants. She is the author of a number of books and studies, including Muslim Women in Britain, Demystifying the Muslimah, published by Routledge in 2012. She's co-author of Religion or Belief, Discrimination and Equality, Written in Global Contexts, published in 2013. And Islamic Education in Britain, New Pluralist Paradigms, published in 2015, as well as Islam on Campus, Contested Identities and the Cultures of Higher Education, published by Oxford University Press in 2020. And as well, she's co-editor of Digital Methodologies in the Sociology of Religion. So as you can see, she has worked extensively across a number of topics and areas related to her work. She led the first, and this is of particular interest to us here, she led the first research exploration of the experiences of children of Muslim heritage in the care system in Britain. And she is a proud adoptive mother of 2 children. So thank you, Dr. Sariya, for giving us your time today, and very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Arafat. I'm always embarrassed when people introduce me, but you don't have to read it all, Arafat. Thank you, though. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you also. We mentioned earlier about there not being a function to applaud our fellow speakers in these online conferences, and I'd actually like to start by applauding, because listening to all of you speak, Rosita, Namin, Arafat, and the others, I was inspired. It was a mirror how little I know about this field and how much more work we need to do, individually, but also collaboratively. So please accept, all of you and the speakers to come, by my virtual applause. Now, I move this conversation away a little bit from legal and historical frameworks, as discussed earlier, to more of the lived experience. The lived experience of children, the lived experience of carers. How have we ended up where we've ended up? And I'd like to start by offering a few reflections on me. How come I'm here, and how has it influenced my take on this field? So I am many things. I am a woman. I happen to be a mother, a wife, a daughter, blah, 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 friend to many people. I am also a sociologist of religion with now quite a robust, quite a large body of research to my name, which I'm grateful for. I don't ever know how I've accomplished this research. I just think it's happened, but it's a good piece of research that I'm proud to put my name to. I'm also a feminist pragmatist scholar. The feminism is important because by feminism, I understand and I emphasize the emotionality of everyday life. That is key to my work. And so today's presentation, I haven't actually prepared a long written paper, which is normally the norm in academic presentations. I haven't done that because sometimes it's difficult to get across a sense of the raw emotionality that is also a part of these discussions. These are children's lives we're talking about, and I wanted to get a sense of that across to everybody. And so what I have is notes and a long conversation that I'm hopefully going to have with you all. My feminism and my pragmatism also insists that I don't do research for research's sake. I do research that addresses and helps resolve a real world problem. And so my feminism and my pragmatism emphasizes that I look at everyday life. So I'm a sociologist who looks at, laws, and, laws form part of my work, religious understandings and theology form part of my work. But I'm really interested in the lived experiences and the real life implications of these quote unquote institutions of life. I am, as Arafat mentioned, I'm a proud adoptive mom, and you can see the backs of their heads there. They're not the horses, they're the children. And Arafat said, two children, I call them my two tiny terrors. But hopefully they won't bang the door down today, and I'll be able to finish this presentation. Now, in terms of the project background, my work in this area emerged over 5 years ago now, when I adopted, or was in the process of adopting and going through the vetting process here. My social worker asked me and my husband to do a lot of reading, and she gave us all these parenting manuals and vulnerable children manuals and caring for them that I was meant to read. I read all the research instead, and what I realized was, back then, BME children wait longer to find permanent placements. This can be adoption, this can be fostering. Muslim children perhaps wait longer still. We do not know for sure, but that's what statistics around ethnicity tell us. The British government does undertake an annual census of looked after children. They include ethnicity there. They do not include religion. But when you look at children of, Bangladeshi, Pakistani heritage, the indications are that they perhaps wait longer still. We have been asking the government to look at religion, and including religion. We began to make some positive steps in the right direction, but then coronavirus happened and the conversation just closed. So hopefully we'll be able to open up those conversations later. We know that there are inadequate numbers of carers coming forward, across the board, limited foster carers, still fewer Muslim carers. Adoption, the scene is a little different. There are enough adopters. Recent statistics tell us that, but again, the right match for children isn't usually forthcoming. And again, I suspect that Muslim children, Muslim carers, Muslim adopters are slower to come forward. Very limited evidence of how social workers understand Islam in particular, faith in general, and finally the whole question that we've already begun to talk about, which is around unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. Now, I'd like to state here, when I first started talking and presenting about this work, I came to it as the novice. And even today, I come to it partly as the novice, but as a novice with a compelling story and compelling research findings to share and tell. I know that today in the audience there are people, and also among the presenters, there will be people who've been researching this area, working in this area for far longer than I have, and I really want to again doff my hat to their expertise. Mine is a particular telling. Mine is a telling aimed at lived experience and aimed at improving policy and practice. But again, it stands on the shoulders of the work that other people have done. So what did I do? I'm going to tell you a little bit. So I had quite this massive aim that was for my research that was far too huge for my own comfort as an academic, and that was to improve the outcomes of Muslim children in the care system by specifically understanding the journeys and contexts in which they occur in order to inform policy and practice. Very large, but we had to keep it large, very wide again, because this was the first piece of work in British context. So research team was me, Miss Savita D'Souza from Core Bath, and I know there are a few people from Core Bath here. Support was co-investigator Alison Alford and Fatsoboti Firi were research assistants. Brilliant jobs that they all have done. And Tay Jiva, who was then of the Knee Appeal, wasn't on the team actually, but her support to the work, her funding of the work, and her mentoring of the work was pretty much outstanding. Big shout out here to Mohammed Bashir, but also lots of adopters, foster carers who gave up their time, and their energy, and told us intimate stories so that we could do this work. What did we do? Quantitative data to try and figure out the number of Muslim children in care. Through a process of triangulation between different data sources, we assume we have approximated around 4,500 Muslim children in care in Britain. This number is full of flaws, but it is, and as we are very proud to admit, it is full of flaws because, for example, we know that there are nearly, again, the same amount, 4.5 unaccompanied asylum-seeking children in this country. Given current socio-political global context, a lot of these children come from, again, quote-unquote Islamic or Muslim countries. The quote-unquote is because I don't think they're necessarily Islamic or Muslim. And I remember sitting with a local authority close by, and we decided to look at their unaccompanied asylum seeking children. She had an Excel sheet in front of her. 25, she had around 25 unaccompanied asylum seeking children. And we said, let's go through the names of these children, because on her Excel sheet, she had recorded ethnicity, she had recorded where they came from, when, age, all sorts of things. But what they hadn't recorded was their religion. But we sat down together and we looked at the countries they came from, we looked at their names, and out of her 20 children, nearly 75% were of Muslim heritage. So this number that I have, 4,500 Muslim children in care, it gives us a useful indication, but it also provides us with the armory to go to the government and say, look, we really need to get a stronger figure. We did a lot of qualitative data, interviews with lots of people, social workers, carers, adopters, prospective adopters, care leavers. We have also so I did all the research, produced my report, and then discovered I was matched with my daughter. So I went off in 6 months leave. But when we've come back, we've also been doing CPD workshops with social workers across the country. I think through all of this, what we want, and we've also done theology work. Through all of this, what we wanted to achieve was this collaborative, what I call a collaborative theology of care that takes into consideration, yes, the theologians, yes, the social workers who are looking after the children and being the professionals in their lives, the adopters and the foster carers who are the intimate carers. But most importantly, within this collaborative theology of care, I think the children are really important and we need to talk about them more. So there's a full report. By the way, that image is me and my son together. He drew it. I think the likeliness is pretty amazing. I don't have a hijab on, but that's fine. Findings and recommendations. There's a longish report that you can read. There are publications that will come out over the next few months, but I'm just going to give you a very quick whistle-stop tour. Now, we made 7 recommendations. I am not going to take you through all of them. I mean, we don't have the time. We didn't have the time before, and now more so we don't have the time, but I'll read them to you. The first one was include religion in SSDA, the national survey of looked after children. The second recommendation, which is what I'm going to concentrate the bulk of today's talk on, is to recognize the salience of faith in children's lives as they journey through the care system. And I'm going to pause here for a few minutes and tell you a few stories from of children that I encountered in my field work. The first was a story of a young care leaver. She was 18 when I interviewed her. She was very keen to be interviewed. She wanted her story to be told. She came into care a couple of years before I interviewed her, and she came into care with her 2 younger brothers. She was now children of Muslim heritage in the British system come into care either because they are asylum seekers, and that's one pathway, and that's sometimes dealt with separately. But if you look at British-born children, they come into care because of various forms of abuse, family abuse, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and the list is endless. There may occasionally be severe mental health issues that might lead children to come into care. Severe poverty as well, although the latter 2 cases are very rare. A small minority of children might be relinquished at birth because unfortunately within Islam, we still have issues around children born out of wedlock. As is always, the burden of the matter falls on young women, young mothers, who then give up, who end up giving up their children. And I think we need to think more about supporting these young mothers. Where was I? I've completely lost track. Yeah. So this young woman I spoke to hadn't ever experienced any abuse. So when you think again of children in care, there is this stereotype of a young person who's probably bad mannered, is troubled deeply because they've experienced so much abuse. Is And I hate to use the word, but damaged is a word that often comes up, unfortunately, and it's a word I shudder to use, but which is something when you talk to people within communities, there is this almost and I think Rosita spoke to that. Oh, we don't want. Or was it Namin? I don't remember. We don't want anything to do with these children because they come with a particular baggage. But this young woman wasn't like that at all. She was soft-spoken, well-mannered, probably possibly a little middle class in her attitude. She and her brothers came into care very suddenly because her parents committed a crime of some sort. She wouldn't tell me what, and I didn't ask. They came into care and were placed in a Black African Caribbean home initially. She says how she didn't eat anything at all on the first day because when she looked into the fridge, she found ham. And she, having come from a practicing Muslim background, was very concerned that everything was now polluted and she refused to eat. This Black Christian carer was very kind and got it immediately. She was an experienced foster carer, and so she took the young woman out shopping, and they bought a load of vegetables, and they cooked it together under this young woman's eagle eye, and everybody ate except this young woman, because as we know, often in such circumstances, the parenting instinct kicks in within the older child. So she didn't eat, but she ensured that her brothers had eaten well. That's important because sibling bonds are really, really important. So moving on, they stayed there for a few days. This was only ever meant to be respite care, respite home. And so they got moved on quite soon to a different home, a South Asian Indian heritage Sikh home. And here there were all sorts of weird foster caring practices. A month after, this wasn't family, this was more like institution. They had to go, it was very regimented. They stayed in their room till food time. They ate, they went back to their room. A month after their placement there, they discovered another foster child had been living there for a few months as well, and they hadn't encountered this other child because of the discipline that was in the procedures in this home. Anyway, it was time to move again, and the young woman moved to a Muslim Bangladeshi home. One of her brothers stayed in the Sikh home. A third brother moved to this time a Hindu South Asian home, and Ramadan came. This older woman the young girl was fine. She was with this Muslim home. She could do Ramadan with the whole paraphernalia that comes with Ramadan, the fried food, the big meals in the evening, the upset tummies after you've eaten so much, but then also the fasting and the piety and the cultural capital that is part of Ramadan. Her brothers, on the other hand, got up at 2 a.m. to get a cold meal outside of the fridge. Anybody who's Muslim will immediately understand the heartbreak for this young woman, for these young boys. As an adoptive mother, I think I nearly cried through this interview, because it is sad that a festival that means so much to people of faith was experienced in this alienated manner by these two young children. The young woman decided, they did have Eid together because there was contact and all the other social work practices, but the nuance was missed. The children decided to lobby. One social worker told them, why are you all complaining? All you South Asians are the same. Another social worker said, I get it. Let's see what I can do. And shortly, the children also decided, yes, let's all threaten to run away from home. And they were very vocal about these threats. But together with this supportive social worker, they all got placed together in the Pakistani home. And when I met them, they'd been there together for a year. It had taken very long. It had taken over a year for them to be together, but they were now thriving. They were doing well. They were beginning to talk about university, the older girl, and they were enjoying schoolwork. I think the salience of faith was really important to their lives. There's one other comment I want to make about this story before I move on, and that is another, and that was talking to these young women. This young woman, I couldn't talk to her brothers because they were minors. I could talk to her. It became very apparent to me that faith was really important to her life. She spoke about drawing strength from her faith. She said, I was concerned that Allah had forsaken me, but at the same time, I knew from the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was with me. He was closer to me than my jugular vein, and I drew solace from that. So that was one thing that was really poignant. The second thing that was really poignant was a separate conversation in which she told me she was enjoying university, but not university, she was enjoying college, but none of her friends at college knew that she was in foster care. They all thought she was living with her biological auntie. And she said she wouldn't ever tell anybody, because as soon as she told anybody, she knew that societal dogma, societal preconceptions, taboos would be imposed on her, because adoption and fostering is still a taboo subject in Islamic communities and Muslim communities. I think that's food for thought, and I ask everybody to pause on that. At this point, I'll also tell you another story, a very brief story this time. This was about another sibling group in a different part of the country. Their parents had suddenly decided to take on a very literal, prescriptive form of Islam. And if the children did not choose, did not agree, did not conform to their parents' faith desires, the children were abused, they were locked up, they were beaten up, they were denied food. Social workers worked long and hard with this family and tried to ensure that, they can, because social workers want to keep families together, and they did everything they could. But when it seemed impossible, these children were taken into care. These children were so damaged by the negative treatment that they had experienced at the hands of people they considered Islamic that they wanted to do nothing with Islam. They insisted on being placed not just in a non-Muslim home, but in a non-religious home. They insisted that they were going to eat ham and pork, because in their little children's mind, ham and pork was un-Islamic, so they were going to do that. More concern, they insisted that they were going to drink alcohol. That was something that social workers could not concede to. It was interesting that in their rebellion, this rebellion that they were enacting, this rejection of faith was also informed by what they understood of faith. And so in their lives, faith remained salient. I have also encountered young people, children's stories who wanted to negotiate faith, who've had one position on faith one day, and as they've grown, matured, they've had another position on faith, from being rejectors, from Islam being something that strengthened their identity, and a lot of movement here. And I think what we really need to understand is that this movement, there needs to be space to understand within social work practice, within research, to understand differing children's understandings, experiences of faith, and then be able to care for them on their own terms, rather than impose our own preconceptions of Islam and of faith on them. Moving on then rapidly. Recommendation 3 was to develop and disseminate Islamic theological guidance on adoption and fostering that prioritizes children's needs. I'll come and talk about this in a minute. Recommendation 4 was linked to the theological guidance around establishing mahram or familial relationships, either through breastfeeding, or was there another way of doing this? Recommendation 5 is around modesty guidelines. Again, previous speakers have alluded to this, and I will come back to this. Recommendation 6 was to the government again. Children's Act 2014 removed the need for ethnic and religious matching when it came to adoption. Our analyses of experience on the ground indicates that social workers are still trying to find ethnic matches, social workers are still trying to find religious matches, but interestingly, paradigms around social hierarchies, conscious and unconscious biases, get embedded into these discourses around what is a good match. And I'll come back to that at the end of my presentation. Oh, that was recommendation 7. Sorry. So that was recommendation 7. 6 was around more outreach work with diverse British Muslim communities. Apologies. So moving on then to theological guidance. And if you're keen, if you've got keen hearing, you'll hear my little girl having an argument with her father outside. So the theological definitions within the Quran, I spoke to an adopter who said as soon as she told her mother and her mother-in-law that she was adopting, they were extremely supportive. And then they spoke to their theologically informed friends, their friends who they considered more religious. And both the mother and the mother-in-law came back saying, oh gosh, so-and-so friend who is an imam or so-and-so friend who's a Muslim scholar says adoption is haram. And that was kind of ratified by what Arafat was saying earlier about, Muslim communities in Islam still not coming, still not getting there in terms of adoption, still not having, codified practices. Again, that was ratified what I think some of the other speakers were saying in terms of Islamic countries not signing up to conventions around adoption. And all of this goes down to Surah 33:5. A lot of this goes down there, where there's a thing within the Quran, a verse within the Quran that says, your adopted children are not like your own. They're not like your biological children. Do not give them your name. And a lot of Muslim scholars, Muslim communities as well as scholars, take that to say that adoption is haram. And to me, as an adoptive mother, to two pretty terrible but terrorizing, but at the same time two very beautiful children, that is actually, and I don't often use strong words, but that is actually an abhorrent interpretation of my faith, which I know well, and which I can interpret for myself as well. And that was the sense that I got from other adopters. It was wrong, perhaps it was a misinterpretation, and more needed to be done around the theology. And this is where I think thanks in particular again to Tejiva from Penny Appeal, who managed to sneak me into a group of scholars. She managed to sneak me into this group of scholars who were preparing and working on this theological guidance. I remember Tay telling me then, it's important that you go, Sariya, because you'll tell the things as they are, you'll talk as an academic, but you'll also talk in a way that's sensitive and to their own religio-cultural norms. They listen to you. So thank you, Tay, for that. They did listen to me, which was brilliant. So I remember being in this group with this group of 60 scholars who were busy talking about Islam and busy talking about adoption, fostering. Interestingly, at that point, they didn't even know the difference between adoption and fostering. They didn't even want a woman to be there, oddly, but they listened. And I must say hats off to those scholars, because what they said was, you've got to relook at definitions of your theme, move away from understandings of your theme solely as an orphan child, but also as a vulnerable child. They concluded that the care of the vulnerable child, according to Islamic law, is a communal obligation. They said we've got to move away from understandings of tabani towards kafala. And actually, when you look at practices, contemporary practices of adoption, particularly in Britain, life story work is absolutely essential. The children know at all times, that they are not your biological children. It's important for the child's sense of identity. My 2-year-old knows that she didn't grow in my tummy and knows that she grew in another lady's tummy. My 5-year-old knows a lot more. And that's what adopters told me. Within the British system in particular, life story work changes the model of adoption, contemporary adoption, so that it's more like kafala and more in line with Islamic practice. And when I shared that with the scholars, they were happy. Within this guidance, they've also addressed issues around name, surname, and yep, that's the big thing that we can talk about perhaps later. But the point to be noted is the verse of the Quran 33:5 that talks about not giving your adoptive children your name also ends with Allah rewarding you for your intention. And we talk about the first part of the verse without talking about the second part of the verse. And so I think more thinking needed there. Secondly, surnames don't perform the same function that they performed 50 years ago. They don't perform the same function that they performed 500 years ago. And so these debates have moved on. The theology needs to respond to these debates and move on as well. And our scholars did this in the British context. Hats off to them. We need more of that. In relation to establishing familial bonds, the scholars first said, let's breastfeed. Let all of us let's all adoptive moms breastfeed. But the thing with breastfeeding is, in my research, I came across evidence where women told me they went on the internet, they downloaded medical guidelines of the internet, then bought hormonal medicines illegally online, and then medicated themselves. Now, anybody who's adopted or anybody who's even had a baby knows that having a baby is a time of great upheaval, even without the hormones. So in adoption, it's a great mental, psychological, physical upheaval. Within that, throwing in hormonal pills is dangerous. It's literally that. And again, talking to the scholars about that, and there were medical professionals about them, they were able to say that actually, if you're adopting a young child and then caring for that child intimately, and again, changing nappies is one of the most intimate things you can do, especially if they're smelly, stinky, horrible ones. But in all seriousness, caring for a child intimately establishes familial bonds. That is what the scholars were able to say, based both on psychological studies, but also theological studies that talk about modesty, among other things, being a product of sexual need and sexual desire. When you've cared for a child that intimately, sexual desire goes. And so particularly in adoptive context, mahramiya does not necessarily need to be established by breastfeeding. And we have worked hard to share this understanding with Muslim communities. We are also working hard to share this with social workers, because there might be some mothers who still feel they want to breastfeed, and then we'd rather they do it under medical supervision rather than on their own. Inheritance is another thing that's discussed in these theological papers. So key recommendation from the scholars, hats off to them. It's a communal obligation if you're able to become adopters or foster carers. This in the tradition of our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and to act as role models for our communities. And this is what I propose, but I actually propose we need a new paradigm, a new Islamic paradigm around the theologies of children in care. We focus on translations of the word yatim as vulnerable child rather than orphans, because that's the reality of the children in our care. And rather than looking at all the at 33:5, verse 33:5 of the Quran, I suggest we look at verse 4, chapter 4, verse 75. And I'm going to read it to you. And this is from Pichtol's translation. How should you not fight for the cause of Allah and the feeble among women and children who are crying, our Lord, bring us forth from out of this town of which people are oppressors. O give us from thy presence some protecting friend. O give us from thy presence some defender. Now, other translators, instead of feeble children, use weak, they use ill-treated, they use oppressed, they use vulnerable. This is the exact definition of the children who come into the British care system. Some translators, instead of protecting friend, use protector, they use defender, they use carers. This to me is the definition of our foster carers and adopters. And we need to move away from a paradigm that says, oh, if, maybe, but, to a paradigm says, yes, of course, this is what we will do if we have the resources to do so. Now, moving on very rapidly, because apologies, Arafat, I think I'm way beyond the time you allocated me now. I said half an hour. I think I'm at 35 now. I'll finish in 5 minutes. We continue to do CPD with social workers. in and across the country. It's slightly paused at the moment because of the pandemic, but we will be starting again. And in terms of raising the religious literacy of social workers, we do not want them to say, right, this is Islam, these are the 5 pillars, these are the 5, beliefs, and this is what you do, and this is the hijab. That is not the kind of religious literacy that we are asking social workers, practitioners, foster carers to develop. Instead, we want them to understand the diversity of Islam, to understand that each and every child is going to be unique. He or she may come into care with a background of deep religious practice, or they may come into care with a background of complete secularity. And we do not want to say to social workers, right, this is how you care for a child of Muslim heritage. We want to say to them, ask the questions, and we want to give you the ammunition that you need, or the tools that you need to ask the questions without being concerned that any of your questions are going to be culturally wrong or politically incorrect. Coming into care and then finding carers is all about being an open book. And all of us as Muslim professionals, as social work professionals, as children in care, need to support our social workers because theirs is a hard job. But we also, within social work practice, encountered unconscious biases. I remember a Muslim social worker, and he might recognize me, saying to me how he was in a panel where they were reviewing a group of Muslim children. And the children had been in care for a few months now, a couple of months, and the older girl who used to be wearing a hijab had stopped wearing a hijab. And all the social workers who weren't aware of Islam said, this might be an example of her confidence. That's probably why now she's removed the hijab. But this Muslim social worker was able to point out that it wasn't because of her confidence that she had possibly removed her hijab. It could also be because she was seeing the need to conform with her foster carers. Perhaps she was placed in a white neighborhood and her hijab was making her feel vulnerable to Islamophobic comment. It could be all sorts of things. And we encourage social workers through our CPD to reflect on their own biases. And finally, we ask social workers to draw on their own cultural heritage to understand the needs of children of Muslim heritage. I think there's a lot of work around community heritage outreach, dismantling stereotypes of social workers. A number of foster carers told us how they thought their children were going to be taken away, if they opened their home to foster care and then opened their home to being assessed. Perhaps social workers would take away their own children. There's a need to raise awareness, ongoing, continuous need to raise awareness within Muslim communities. Tejiva did some work with her mosque outreach, where she went out to mosques and spoke to Muslim communities, but there's so much more needed. Muslims still think that they are saints, holier than thou, and the issues around abuse simply don't happen in Muslim communities. And we need more work around Islamic theology and confirming to communities that Islam is on the side of vulnerable children. And obviously, we need more research. Now, I'm very quickly going to offer some conclusions, literally 5 minutes. As I reflect on all of this, it's all about identity, but identity is complex. And we shouldn't simplify it. Identity is fluid and it changes based on who's doing the talking. Is it the social worker who's commenting on identity? Is it the child? Is it the carer? Who's commenting on this identity? I remember some Afghani children who were branded as misbehaved because they'd come to Britain as unaccompanied asylum seekers. They were running away from home all the time. It then turned out there was a dog in the home, and these children were simply not used to dogs for theological and social reasons. Another group of children were branded as bad-mannered because they didn't know how to eat at the table with a fork and a knife, and they sat down on the ground and ate with their fingers. So who's actually doing the perception of identity? And a social worker told me how they had long-standing foster carers who'd been fostering for 20 years. And once a South Asian social worker went into their home, and the South Asians in this room will get it. The social worker heard the foster carer call their child call a child in their care kutta, which means dog, in a very pejorative kind of way. So whose identity and who's perceiving this identity? That's key to our notions of children in care. Memory is a part of identity. What do the children remember? What do social workers remember of memory of Islam? Is their memory, is their understanding of Islam colored by memories of terror attacks? Or is their perception of Islam colored by a wonderful holiday in Morocco or Turkey where they've encountered Islamic culture? Finally, identity is intersectional, and for the children in our care, age, gender, ethnicity, faith, everything comes into consideration. It's a really big, complex intersection that needs to be disconnected in our work with and for children. Faith, as Salvatore tells us in relation to Islam, is an assemblage of diverse, local, global interlinkages. And asking our social workers to disentangle that is a big ask. So we need to give the profession the tools they need, as well as give our carers the tools they need. And in Britain, Islam is really diverse. I'm going to end with 3 questions and a final reflection. What about Black Lives Matter? So ethnic hierarchies that shape our notions of each other. What about religion in a profession that is deemed secular? Social work is seen as secular, although it had roots in Christian tradition. So what about religion? Does religion fit? I would say it does, particularly in relation to meeting the needs, because what social work practice does is prioritizing the whole needs of the child. And within the whole needs come faith and well-being needs. And finally, what about the overlap between secular social work and pious readings of religious texts? Is it always a disconnection? As our work with the scholars show, actually, it isn't a disconnection, and there are deep spaces for coming together, for agreement, particularly in relation to caring for our children. And everything that I've just outlined here, the hierarchies of and politics of knowledge, social work knowledge, Islamic knowledge, theological knowledge, caring knowledge, these are not neutral. These are all shaped by hierarchies of society. You know, is black knowledge better than white knowledge, better than brown knowledge? These are questions that we do not ask in academia, but need to ask of more. And in particular, for this work, we need to consider the impact of all of this knowledge and the hierarchies within them on the lives of children, the most vulnerable of children. To end then, whatever I have said and whatever all of us have said is only valid and useful if it is of benefit to the children. It has to be child-focused, the theologies, the sociologies. And to conclude then, if one child, and I say this often, so often that it's become cliched, one child benefits from this work that I have done, I will deem the work a success. Thank you very much, everybody, for the opportunity to present this work. I am ever so grateful. And now how to put my presentation off. Typical, isn't it? Now I won't know how to do that. Stop share.
Brilliant.
There you go.
Thank you, Dr. Sariya Cheruvalil-Contractor. That was a very rich, and again, I wish we had all day, really. I mean, if we had been able to convene in person, that would have been the idea to kind of, there was a lot there, and I'm glad to note that there have been questions sort of coming in. What I would like to do is to allow some of our audience members, if they're so interested, you can ask questions yourself. What we will have to do, and this is for University of Cambridge technical reasons, they will stop the recording for legal reasons, media release provisions. But if you would like to ask a question, please use the raise hand. Is that correct? The raise hand function on your Zoom. I'm not sure if I see it. Otherwise, we have. Okay. Sorry, I don't know if you're able to see the chat boxes. There's a question there from Brian Sloan. Yeah.
Yeah. So So in the context of England then, so although in relation to naming, the common practice is for us to and not just in terms of legal practice, but also for the well-being of the child. It's a good thing if the child has the same surname as his or her family. I mean, imagine going to school and on Teachers' Day, or your mother has on Parent Teachers' Day, your mother has a different surname to you, and so there are clear well-being reasons, psychological reasons for suggesting that the child has the same surname as its adoptive parent. So in England, that is the recommendation. They also recommend, so they recommend that you don't change the first name, but that you change the surname of the child. But when you come to think about it, I mean, I know an adopter who said they adopted thrice, 3 children. They weren't related to each other. And in case of all 3 children, they didn't have to change surnames because the children had the surname Khan. And their surname was Khan. So it worked really well. But with somebody like me who's got a slightly unique surname, it was more complicated. But we did give our children our surname. And we actually think this is in the ethos of Islamic practice, because as I said, our surname, and indeed many surnames, do not serve the same practice that they did previously. It is more about profession, place where you are. So my husband's great-great-grandfather was actually a contractor, and so that's our surname. So I think we need more reflection on the role of surnames and what the scholars were able to say. If it's in the need of the child, if it meets in the child's interest, then you can actually do quite a lot, because what they said, and this is really interesting, is that when it comes to caring for these children, what trumps everything else is the child's jaan, or the child's life, and the child's iman, which is the child's faith. Everything else is a secondary consideration, and that is what social work says as well. The key thing is the child's well-being and the child, protecting the child's interest. So that's it in relation to name. I'm trying to, in terms of inheritance, there isn't really a big issue. The Quranic law says that you can give up to 1/3 to your child, and that's fine within the theology. Most adoptive parents said, these are our children, who else are we going to give our money to? So there's an interesting tension there between theological religion and lived religion, but I don't think a particularly massive issue. The big issue, I think, is around mahramiya, establishing familial relations, and do you have to breastfeed your child to do that, or lactate your child? Scholars said if you can do it, do it. Social workers have been saying, after we've been sharing our recommendations, that if this is happening under the radar, they will actually now ask Muslim adoptive mums and family couples, if this is something you're planning to do. They're then organizing medical support. And I've also worked with Quorum Baths, a team at Quorum Bath, who are writing guidance notes on breastfeeding. So, and the thing is, us British have funny attitudes, because in America, breastfeeding is not seen as particularly problematic. But I think here we've got a stiff upper lip and all of that. Okay, let me try and find other questions. No more questions.
Yeah, so I will. Thank you, Dr. Sariya. So thank you, and thank you to Brian Sloan for really. I think the question is quite right, that as our first panel, the panelists in our first session also highlighted, that the question of inheritance and the question of surnames are two of the, I don't know if they're the only, but two of the major concerns. Something I'll note, one of the things I was trying to point out about the need, and I think you're recognizing that as well, that we have a need to understand how basically Muslim naming conventions, because the Islamic legal norms originated in a particular context, and we have inherited those norms in a different context. But often we have inherited those Islamic legal norms without realizing how the context has changed. So we don't, and I would say that we often don't know why we have the names that we do have. So I'll mention, for instance, actually just earlier this week, I read a really interesting piece by a scholar in the US. She's doing her PhD at Cornell. Her name is Afifa Latif. Her research is on Black Tunisians, and she published a really interesting piece on the names of Black Tunisian, like basically the sort of what I would call the onomastics of slavery, like the sort of legacy of slavery that attaches to the names that were given to descendants of enslaved people in Tunisia in the Muslim context. And so this is in the context of naming laws. And what they're now doing, so basically there's now a movement among them to sort of reject the names that they were given by the state in the context of the state, because those names carry pejorative connotations, right? They carry memories of slavery. So that is just a way to sort of acknowledge that, as you said in your keynote quite rightly, things were different even barely 50 years ago in terms of surnames, let alone 500 years ago, let alone many centuries ago.
Arafat, there's an important question from Michael Russell. Do I have the time to spend 2 minutes on it?
Yes,
so
please.
Michael Russell asks about the Cameron government's 2014 matching requirements, and I alluded to that in my recommendations briefly. So these matching basically relate to adoption, and the need for ethnic and religious matching was removed from Children's Act. And so social workers by law now are no longer required to find perfect matches or near perfect matches when looking for families for children, adoption in relation to adoption in particular. Now, when I spoke to adopters and prospective adopters, overwhelmingly, they weren't interested in ethnicity, they weren't interested in religion, but they did say, we want the child to look like us so that when I go to Tesco, I don't stand out. So we had an adopter who was Greek Orthodox Christian saying she wanted a Muslim. She would be very happy to adopt a Muslim child because Greek skin tone and Asian skin tone are very similar. Similarly, adopters, saying Asian adopters saying, oh, we'd like South European, sort of Spanish children would be good because they've got dark hair, dark eyes. So though it was interesting, ethnicity, religion didn't matter to adopters, but they wanted to look like their children. So that's one consideration. Then I looked at then there was the whole issue of children's identity. And as you can see, faith is salient in different ways, whether they reject it or whether they accept it, faith remains salient. And so I think you need people who are aware of this. And so I think religious matching is important. Coming to what social workers were actually doing. So years of experience has dictated social work practice that indicates matching is good for children's well-being. In our work, children's in both, now moving away from just adoption to both adoption and foster care, children often settled better. Like, the young woman I spoke to you all about, she settled really well when she was placed in a Pakistani Muslim home. So when it comes to social work practice, social workers are still looking for perfect or near perfect matches. This is what parents want, adoptive parents want. Foster carers also say that we would be, while they were happy to care for children from any background, and we found devout Muslims, Bangladeshi Muslims caring for white children, non-religious children, vice versa, non-religious parents doing an extremely brilliant job with religious children. So it's a mixed mash. But in terms of how this government's, the Cameron's change is being applied, social workers still try. And if they can find a perfect or a near perfect match, they will try and do that. Because that is what their profession tells them is in the best interest of the child in negotiating issues around identity. It was, however, interesting that there is also some emerging evidence of around how social hierarchies, conscious and unconscious biases might be affecting this. So, for example, there was this case where a young baby, a baby or twin babies, I can't remember, came into care quite straight after birth. They ended up staying in care for over 9 months. Why? Because the child, let's assume it was just a baby, was of half Muslim Asian and half white non-religious heritage. And while there was a queue of Muslim parents waiting for this child, and that's the other problem actually. Muslim parents want babies because of the whole lactation thing, but I'm not going to talk about that now. There was a queue of Muslim parents for this baby. They wouldn't place her because they felt that the non-religious aspect of her identity wouldn't be protected. Whereas often we hear about Muslim babies being placed in non-religious white families. And so I think a little more interrogation of these hierarchies and the impact that these hierarchies have on matching needs to be undertaken. But we really think in terms of our research that, yeah, the 2014 changes is not really working. It is opening up the pathway for harder to place children to be placed longer, and that is good. But we don't think that the best way to enhance children's journeys and to speeden up permanency is by saying, okay, let's place them anywhere. Instead, we say we need a lot more investment in recruiting BME parents, adopters, foster carers, and thankfully John Simmons is here. The government has actually invested in diversifying the recruitment of BME adopters, all adopters, but within that BME adopters as well. So the government is listening, but yeah, we want them to listen a bit more.